Wolfe didn't answer. He only breathed slowly, as if conserving energy. But I knew that look. It meant he was thinking past me, back into the layers of the case that even he hadn't entirely unknotted. I shifted in my seat and said, "All right. What's bothering you?" He glanced at me, then at the row of books on the shelf to his right. "Dale," he said. "Dead and gone." "Yes." "And too neatly." I raised a brow. "You think his death wasn't an accident?" "I think men like Dale do not drown alone, and they do not do so without reason. There was an old case. Dale's death in 1984 had been ruled an accident, a fall from a dock while under the influence. No signs of foul play, but Wolfe had always distrusted convenient endings. "Stoller?" I asked. "Perhaps," he said. "Or someone else." But the clock's chime, those two distinct strikes, was not just a signal to Miss Roundtree or to Arling. It was, I believe, a cipher, a code, a symbol, Wolfe said. One ring to mark the past, one ring to warn the future. I let that hang in the air for a moment. The poet in Wolfe only came out at times like this, when the facts had been mostly sorted, but the truth still wandered off like a guest who wasn't ready to say goodbye. I stood and poured him another brandy. "So," I said, handing it over, "where does that leave us?" He looked at the glass, then up at me. "Where we always are. In possession of more than we can say, and less than we'd like to know." The next morning, Saul Panzer called. "Got something," he said. "Possibly nothing, but maybe not." Hit me. "Found a customs declaration filed 6 months ago under a shell company tied to Stoller's last known Geneva address. It's not for artwork, it's for documentation." "What kind?" "Old ledgers." One was labeled MS Registry 2A. MS. Marcus Stoller. Or Marcus and Stoller, Saul said. "Either way, it's on a private boat currently docked outside Lisbon, registered under a neutral flag." I whistled. "So the man's still moving pieces around." "Looks that way." I thanked him and hung up. Wolfe listened to the update and nodded slightly. Then it continues. "And us? We observe." That was the unspoken oath in Wolfe's world. "We intervene where needed. We do not chase. Not unless the chase comes into our house." Later that day, Lydia sent one final note, handwritten, elegant. "I've moved the Dale clock into secure storage. It will not ring again, but thank you both for listening when no one else believed there was a sound at all." I left it on Wolfe's desk. He read it, said nothing. That evening, the brownstone was quiet again. The real kind of quiet. The kind that holds no echo. I made dinner arrangements with a brunette who'd waited patiently while I helped Wolfe dismantle a decades-old conspiracy, then spent the hour before my reservation on the office sofa flipping through old case notes. Wolfe stayed in his chair, unmoving. Before I left, I said, "You sure you don't want to write it up? Even if it's incomplete?" He looked at me. "What title would you give it?" I shrugged. "The Clock That Rang Twice." He considered, then nodded. "Too poetic, but apt." I put on my coat. "You know, you never did say exactly when you knew it was Stoller behind it all." "I didn't," Wolfe said. "I suspected." "There's a difference. But you knew he'd come to you in the end." He allowed himself a faint smile. He heard the second chime. I smiled back. "And you?" "I heard both," he said. "The past and the present." I stepped into the hallway, hat in hand. Behind me the brownstone held its breath. No clocks chimed, no letters arrived. But the silence was complete. And this time it felt like peace. It was 4 days after the quiet exit of Alexander Stoller and 3 since Saul's call about the ledger shipment docked in Lisbon. The brownstone had resumed its standard rhythm. 3 meals precisely timed, orchids lovingly misted, and me wrestling the typewriter into obedience for case summaries. Wolfe would never read and would certainly never write himself. I thought we were finished. So did Wolfe. We were wrong. It started, as these things tend to, with something minor. A letter, unsigned and mailed from Portugal. arrived in a plain envelope on a rainy Thursday morning. I opened it, skimmed it once, and brought it straight to Wolfe, who was pretending not to be reading the Atlantic Monthly for the fourth time. The note was typed on cheap paper. There was a third ring. "You missed it." That was all. Wolfe read it. Said nothing. I said what needed to be said. "So, not quite done after all." Wolfe stared at the words. Then quietly, "A challenge from Stoller." No. He would never make a mistake that's sentimental. He rose. That in itself was significant. "I need to see the folio." "You can't. It's in federal hands now." "I don't need it in my hand," he said. "I need it in my mind." Which meant I got to spend the rest of the day rereading our notes aloud, while Wolfe sat in a straight-backed chair in the plant room, eyes closed, mouthing phrases to himself like they were bits of a forgotten opera. At 6:11 p.m., just as Fritz was laying out braised squab with black olives and mint risotto, Wolfe returned to the office and said, "3 rings." I waited. He said 1 at midnight. 1 seconds later. The third, never heard. But marked. Marked where? "In the folio," he said. There was a gap between the final entries and the appendix. So, the pages were misnumbered. Wren didn't notice. Arling didn't either, but someone removed a sheet. Not recently. Years ago. I blinked. "You're saying the folio was already tampered with before it ever reached Grumman?" "Yes. The third chime is the real warning left behind by the person who took the sheet." He paused, and I know who it was. He reached for the phone and dialed. The next morning, Lydia Roundtree returned to the brownstone. She looked rested, clear-eyed and utterly calm. Wolfe didn't offer pleasantries. He simply said, "Tell us about the real item that vanished from the Dale estate. The one no one listed, the one you found, then removed before the inventory reached Arling." She was silent for a moment. Then, "It was a letter, a single page, dated 1984. It was from Marcus Dale to Alexander Stoller." Wolfe nodded. "And in it, he confessed," she said softly. "He named people, not just Stoller, not just Belden, others. Politicians, brokers, even museum directors. People who helped move stolen artifacts into private collections. He wrote it days before he died. I think he meant it as a final reckoning. And you destroyed it." "No," she said. "I kept it, but I never turned it over. I didn't know who to trust. When the clock chimed, I hoped someone else knew. That they were telling me it was time." Wolfe leaned back, closed his eyes. "You were the third ring, Miss Roundtree." She said nothing. Wolfe opened his eyes again. "Give me the letter, and I will make sure it is heard by those who need to hear it." She hesitated, then reached into her coat and pulled it from the inner lining. It was folded, yellowed, real. I took it. My hands shook a little. Wolfe looked at her with something near approval. Not warmth. He's not built for that, but a kind of solemn respect. "You have done what Dale could not," he said. "You have preserved the truth." We released the letter quietly, through channels Wolfe trusted. There were inquiries, investigations, retirements. The final ledger, MS Registry 2A, was intercepted in Lisbon. As Wolfe predicted, the shipment had included copies, sealed pages, even a private ledger detailing Stoller's payouts over the years. The story never made front-page news, but in the museums, things changed. Artifacts disappeared from walls. Descriptions were rewritten. A few returned home. It was quiet. Precise. Just like Wolfe. 3 weeks later, Wolfe sat in the office with his final glass of beer and declared the case closed. He didn't file it. He didn't want to name it. But I did. The clock that rang twice. It rang once for the lie that was lived. It rang again for the truth that was hidden. And the third, that was for the reckoning that finally came. And in Wolfe's house, where silence is sacred and nothing ever happens without reason, no clocks have chimed since. The clock chimed once, then again. By the third, someone was dead. Welcome to Faded Echoes. I am your host, Ombra. Jump into the comments. Where in the world are you tuning in from? I always look forward to your messages. If you're ever looking for a case that Nero Wolfe would rather ignore, but ends up accepting anyway, usually because it scratches some intellectual itch of his or because someone tampered with something in the brownstone, you might take a seat and listen to the tale of the clock that rang twice. It's got all the right elements: a ticking anomaly, a twitchy visitor, and a breakfast ruined by ill-timed doorbells. The day it started, I had just returned from delivering a package to the post office. Wolfe's idea of physical labor, and had shed my coat when the front doorbell rang. Not once, but twice. That may not sound like much to you, but in our house, ringing twice is a social felony, on par with entering the orchid room without permission or suggesting that canned mushrooms are acceptable in any cuisine. Fritz, who was in the kitchen reducing stock and frowning at the suggestion of adding nutmeg, glanced toward the hallway as if the doorbell had insulted his lineage. I gave him a shrug and answered the door. She stood there wrapped in a wool coat that probably cost more than my monthly salary, despite the fact that it looked like she'd slept in it. Her lipstick was smeared slightly, as if applied in a taxi without a mirror, and her gloves didn't match, left black, right navy, but it was her eyes that did it. Big, sharp, and scanning like a hawk over my shoulder. "Mr. Wolfe," she said. "I need Mr. Wolfe. Now." "Well, that's going to be a bit of a challenge," I said, stepping aside. "He's not generally available on demand, even for people who ring politely. And you rang like you were trying to wake the dead." "I'll wait," she said, pushing past me with the firm decisiveness of someone who expected the world to cooperate. She was in the front room before I could even get a name out of her. I shut the door. Then I turned and looked up the stairs, where the faint creak of the second step had probably already sent tremors into Wolfe's peace. 5 minutes later, I had her seated on the red settee and offered coffee. She refused, then accepted, then said she preferred tea. "Name's Miss Lydia Roundtree," she said, holding the cup like it might bite her. "You don't know me. I work at the West 58th offices of Grumman and Larchmont Antique Restoration. I'm not a client, yet." I was already intrigued. People usually didn't come announcing that they weren't clients. It's like walking into a doctor's office and saying, "I'm not sick, but I'd like to cough dramatically for a while." "What do you need restored?" I asked. "An antique mirror, a reputation, a clock," she said. "Or rather, I need someone to explain why it struck twice at midnight. It shouldn't have struck at all." I gave her my best try again look, the one I reserve for people explaining why they thought they could skip out on a bill. "I know how it sounds," she said, "but this is a very specific clock. French, 1863, gilded bronze, formerly belonged to Senator Marcus Dale. It hasn't struck in over 2 decades. Then last night it struck once, paused, and struck again. And you think the clock is trying to tell you something?" "I think," she said, putting down the tea with a clink, "that someone is using the clock to frighten me, or signal me, or both. I think someone's tampered with it, and that person may be connected to something else that went missing, something important." Now, we were getting somewhere. I gave her a moment, watching her hands tremble as she folded her gloves. Wolfe doesn't like being surprised, but he's got a soft spot for the symbolic. A clock chiming twice when it shouldn't. That might just squeak under his velvet rope. I told her to wait. Then I went to the office and stood in the doorway. He was already scowling. "She rang the bell twice," I said. "An uncivilized act," Wolfe muttered without opening his eyes. "You should have turned her away. She's got a clock that shouldn't chiming at midnight. Twice. Full. And a possible theft. Or a signal. And the clock once belonged to a senator who drowned under very suspicious circumstances in 1984. His eyes opened. Just slightly. "The Dale affair. Sane Dale. She works in the restoration firm that handled his estate's items. Something's been moved, or stolen, or signaled. And she looks rattled." He stared at me for a long 5 seconds, which for Wolfe is the equivalent of a marching band playing Yankee Doodle in shock. "Bring her in." And just like that, the clock that rang twice had struck again, this time inside Nero Wolfe's brownstone. I led Lydia Roundtree into the office like I was escorting a nervous suspect into a confession booth. She didn't seem intimidated by the setting. Most people get a little fidgety once they're inside Wolfe's lair, with its medieval chair, Turkish rug, and the man himself sitting like an overfed Buddha under the twin stairs of bookshelves and silence. Lydia just stepped in, sat on the edge of the red armchair, across from Wolfe, and waited like she was ready to call a bluff. Wolfe didn't look at her immediately. He was finishing his glass of beer, slow and deliberate. That's his version of a handshake. Once the glass was empty, he set it down, folded his hands, and gave her a look that could have fossilized spinach. "You may explain," he said. Lydia took a breath, smoothed her skirt, and did just that. "As I told your assistant, I work for Grumman and Larchmont. We specialize in the restoration of antique timepieces, fine art frames, instruments, and so on. Mostly private collectors, estate attorneys, and museums. We handled a job 3 weeks ago, some items from the Dale estate, which has been in probate for years, but is finally being liquidated. The clock was part of that job." Wolfe nodded once, the slow kind that usually means, "Get to the meat, madam, and pass the gravy." "It's an elaborate piece," she went on. "Empire-style French mantel clock, Cupid with a lyre, ormolu finish, inset enamel dial. Very fragile. It hadn't worked in years. We were told not to attempt to fix it. The mechanism was inert, locked. But last night at midnight it struck. Once," Wolfe said. "Twice," with a pause in between. "That's peculiar," Wolfe murmured. "Who heard it?" "I did. I was staying late at the restoration studio. I'd fallen asleep on the settee in the back room. When it struck, I woke up immediately. It echoed. There's no mistaking it. I piped in, because it was too tempting. If the clock hasn't worked in 20 years, that's more than peculiar. That's practically resurrection." "Who else was in the building?" Wolfe asked. "No one. We close at 8. The security door downstairs locks automatically. I had the only key last night." He studied her for a moment. "Then, and the next morning," she said, leaning forward, "the folio was gone." That got Wolfe's attention. His brow lifted a fraction of an inch. "What folio?" I asked. "A leather-bound catalogue. Handwritten entries from the Dale family's acquisitions. It wasn't supposed to be there. It was included by mistake, and meant to be returned to the estate attorney's office, but I'd locked it in the cabinet overnight, just in case. And this morning, it was missing. Cabinet still locked. No signs of tampering." "Folly," Wolfe said. That wasn't directed at her, just the universe in general. When Wolfe doesn't like a situation, the word makes an appearance. It's like a dog growling before it bites. "What, precisely, was in this folio?" he asked. She hesitated. "We don't know all of it. It was a ledger of acquisitions, artworks, sculptures, heirlooms, some of them quite old. But some entries didn't match public records. Uncatalogued purchases. Items not declared in Dale's official estate. That's why I didn't leave it unattended, and now it's gone." "That would be a problem," I said. "Especially if someone doesn't want those items known. I think someone used the clock to distract me, or warn me." Wolfe raised a hand. "You make too much of an atmospheric detail. Clocks do not ring for effect. They ring because they are made to ring. The question is not who wanted to frighten you, but who made the clock strike." Lydia looked both relieved and unnerved, like a woman who just found out her ghost is a burglar. "That's what I want to know," she said. "Someone knew about that folio, and they knew where to find it." Wolfe closed his eyes. That meant he was done with her for now. "Mr. Goodwin will accompany you to your place of employment," he said. "He will examine the clock and the room. He will ask questions, answer them." I gave her a nod and stood. "Grab your coat, we'll take a cab. I'll expense it, and Wolfe will complain." "I never complain," Wolfe muttered. "I rebuke." Grumman and Larchmont was nestled in a 4-story building near Columbus Circle, wedged between a shuttered piano showroom and a gym that advertised boxing with ballet. The front windows had iron bars that looked antique but weren't, and the glass door had the etched logo of the firm's name in that kind of serif font that makes you feel underdressed just looking at it. Inside, it smelled like lemon oil and old varnish. Lydia led me up a flight of narrow stairs to the second floor and into the main restoration room, a mix of counters, velvet mats, loupes, magnifying rigs, and racks of drawers labeled with things like gild leaf loose and dials Roman. It was clean but not sterile. The kind of place where the past gets spruced up under a microscope. She pointed to the clock. It sat under a glass dome on a walnut shelf against the north wall. I stepped over and gave it a once-over. It looked harmless enough. Regal. 18 inches tall, Cupid poised in bronze mid-pluck. The lyre coiled with gilt scrollwork. The face was white enamel with Roman numerals and blued steel hands. The case was dustless. No wires, I said. No extra mechanism? None, she said, and no one touched it except me. Has anyone else asked about the folio? I asked. Any visitors? Employees acting twitchy. She hesitated, then crossed to a desk and pulled a folder from a drawer. We log all visitors, appointments. This one showed up 2 days ago. She handed me a sign-in sheet. The name caught my eye. Howard T. Merle. That meant something. Took me a minute, then I got it. He was Marcus Dale's former assistant. The man had testified to the Senate Ethics Committee after Dale's death, saying he'd been asked to handle irregular purchases. He'd been quiet ever since. Did he ask for the folio? I said. No. He said he wanted to inspect the frame on a lithograph that came in with the estate. He barely looked at it. And he left early, before his appointment time was up. I thought it was odd, but people don't always say what they're looking for. Did he come near the cabinet? I can't be sure. I was in and out. I walked to the cabinet in question. It was a standard fire-rated piece, with a keyed lock and reinforced frame. Not impossible to pick, but not something you do in under a minute with no one noticing. May I asked. She nodded, handing me the key. I opened it. Nothing jumped out, just a few restoration reports, some antique clock hands and a rolled parchment in a cardboard sleeve. The space where the folio would have been was obvious, like a book removed from a tightly packed shelf. I stepped back. Someone was here, I said. They came for that folio, and they either knew it would be there or guessed. The clock may have been tampered with to lure you out, or unsettle you. I took a quick look at the clock again. No signs of forced access, but I wasn't an expert, which meant it was time to bring in someone who was. Back at the brownstone that evening, I gave Wolfe the rundown. He didn't move an inch the whole time. When I mentioned Howard T. Merle, his eyebrows twitched. Why would a man who vanished into the shadows after a Senate scandal re-emerge for an anonymous lithograph? That's what I'm wondering. Wolfe tapped a finger against the arm of his chair. Mr. Goodwin, we will proceed with delicacy. The theft of a folio is trifling. The recovery of information not meant to be seen, that is substantial. And the clock. A message, Wolfe said. But not to Miss Rowntree. Someone else rang it, and someone else was meant to hear it. That was new. You think the clock wasn't for her? I think, Wolfe said, we are in a room with more than one door. And only one has been opened. He closed his eyes, which meant the conversation was over. For now. But the case had begun, and so had the ticking. I didn't waste time the next morning. If Wolfe had started using metaphors like rooms and doors, that meant he'd already decided the surface story wasn't worth polishing. And when Wolfe starts poking around for what lies beneath, it's usually a good idea to start digging before he asks you to. While Fritz was serving breakfast, shirred eggs, toast points and a sauce that smelled like garlic and white wine had just eloped. I made a quick call to Saul Panzer. If there was a guy who could tell you whether a supposedly dead clock had twitched its gears under suspicious circumstances, it was Saul. He wasn't just a good detective, he had a mechanical mind that could spot a fake spring mechanism in a magician's pocket watch at 30 feet. He said he'd meet me at Grumman and Larchmont by noon. Until then, I figured I'd start chasing the more human angles. First up, Howard T. Merle. A quick search of the usual haunts didn't turn up a home address, but I did find something better. A recent billing address tied to a private mailbox service downtown. I hopped a cab and 20 minutes later I was standing in a narrow storefront between a vape shop and a dry cleaner, watching a nervous teenager in a headset sort through envelopes like they were playing cards. When I asked about box 11142, the kid looked at me like I'd asked for the nuclear codes. I slid him a 10. He looked at it, then handed it back. We don't give out client information. I pulled out a 20. Then another. He glanced around, took the bills and said, "The guy who rents that box comes in once a week, usually Thursdays. Real precise. Gray suit, quiet. Tall, hair like it's combed with a ruler. Last week he signed in as Howard T. Merle, but last month it was H. Thomason. We don't check IDs." "Of course not," I said. "God forbid you break the illusion." I stepped out, made a note to tail Merle the next Thursday, and called Wolfe to check in. He answered on the third ring, which in our world means either he's upset about something, or he wants you to think he is. "I have spoken with Miss Rowntree," he said. "She has given me the full list of items delivered with the Dale collection. I have also reviewed the provenance notations. They are irregular, meaning some entries are too neat, too modern. Someone attempted to retroactively clean the record, and in doing so they left clues." That was Wolfe's version of excitement. "I'm meeting Saul in 20 minutes, I said. "He'll look at the clock." "Good. And you will then locate Mr. Merle." "I already have a lead." "Excellent. Mr. Goodwin, this is not simply theft. This is history laundering. Someone is trying to unwrite the past." That line stuck with me even after I hung up. Saul met me at the studio, wearing his usual uniform, gray suit, thin tie expression that said, "I'll see through your soul and invoice you for it." Lydia greeted us both and took us back to the restoration room. Saul went to work. He didn't talk much. He never does when he's focused. But he did mutter once or twice, and I saw his left eyebrow lift when he removed the back plate. When he was done, he turned to me and Lydia. "Someone rearmed the mainspring," he said. "Not fully, just enough to let it strike twice before jamming again." "Could that happen accidentally?" Lydia asked. "No, not unless you think squirrels have developed an interest in French Empire clocks." That got a weak smile out of her. "So someone wound it," I said, "and left it just strong enough to chime once, pause, then again." Saul nodded. "Manual triggering. They didn't wind the time mechanism, just the strike. They must have known exactly how to do it. Someone who understands antique clock mechanics," I said. "That narrows it." Lydia looked queasy. "We have 3 part-time restorers who rotate in. They all know clockwork. I made a note to get their names." Saul reassembled the piece and stepped back. "Whoever did it wanted an effect. The delay between strikes was precise. This wasn't about function, it was about message." Lydia was silent for a moment. "Then, there's something else." She crossed to the back and opened a drawer in her desk. From it, she pulled a photo, black and white, faded at the edges, mounted on archival board. It showed a young Marcus Dale standing beside an older man at what looked like a gallery. They were shaking hands in front of a painting of a sailing ship. "I found this yesterday. It was inside one of the transport crates, folded into a lining." "Who's the other man?" I asked. "That's Roger Belden. He owned the Eaglehurst Gallery before it went bankrupt in the 90s. The name meant something. Eaglehurst had been involved in a long-ago scandal about forged provenance and smuggled pieces. Nothing ever stuck, but the stink lingered. Wolfe said someone was trying to unwrite history," I muttered. "Maybe it's the kind of history that comes back with handcuffs." We were interrupted by the doorbell downstairs. Lydia excused herself, and I waited, flipping the photo over. On the back was a handwritten note Belden confirms shipment to Arling's private registry. Dated, sealed. When Lydia returned, she looked rattled. That was Mr. Arling, Charles Arling. Should I know that name? He's the estate executor. He's never come here in person. And now he has. He says he needs to review the security surrounding the Dale collection. He's waiting downstairs. I looked at Saul, then back at her. Let him in. But don't say anything about the clock or the folio yet. Arling turned out to be a cool customer in a blue suit and tortoiseshell glasses. He had the air of a man who had learned long ago to smile only when necessary. Lydia introduced me as a consultant for object verification, which I took as a charming lie. Arling walked the floor slowly, taking mental notes. Miss Rowntree, I'm concerned about inconsistencies in the estate's itemization. I've had calls from 2 museums and 1 gallery inquiring about pieces that shouldn't have been on record. Which pieces? She asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned to me. And your name? Goodwin. Archie Goodwin. His eyes flickered, just slightly. Then back to Lydia. I will be conducting a full review, he said. Effective immediately. If anything else turns up, notes, receipts, images, I expect to be informed. Of course, Lydia said. But may I ask why now? His lips thinned. Because it appears the dead are talking again. He left, without another word. Back at the brownstone that night, Wolfe was waiting. He'd already received Saul's report. So, he said, we have a reawakened clock, a missing folio, a questionable photograph, and a resurrected scandal, plus a shady executor. I added. Wolfe nodded. Miss Rowntree was a pawn. The real conflict is between those who buried the Dale acquisitions and those who want them exhumed. I dropped the photo on his desk. Belden, Arling, Dale. 3 names that probably knew too much about what never got written down. Wolfe stared at the image. There is a 4th name, he said softly. Find it. And if I do, he closed his eyes. Then I shall summon them. And the clock may strike again, but it will not be for effect. The next morning began with Fritz's usual quiet mastery in the kitchen. Soft poached eggs on herb toast with a light tarragon, hollandaise, but the atmosphere in the brownstone was anything but tranquil. Wolfe hadn't spoken much after I returned the night before, which in his world meant his mental engines were engaged in some heavy lifting. When he's working on a case, his silence is less about withdrawal and more like a python coiling in the dark. He broke it halfway through breakfast. Miss Rowntree's photo is significant, he said. No argument there, I said. Belden and Dale together is fishy, especially with that note on the back, shipment to Arling's private registry. What's that mean? It means, Wolfe said, reaching for his beer, that Arling was not merely executor to the estate. He was a participant. That registry suggests he maintained a secondary record, possibly of items acquired unofficially, perhaps even illicitly, so the missing folio might have been a copy of that registry, or a bridge to it, Wolfe said. The clock was a lure, the theft was the act, but the act itself was not the motive. The motive was concealment, by those who fear exposure, and revelation, by those who seek advantage, which means someone knew that folio was here, I said, and wanted it gone before someone else found it. Wolfe sipped, closed his eyes, and added, Mr. Goodwin, it is time you interviewed the restorers. That was the signal. He'd mapped the perimeter, and now wanted me to start pushing at the walls. I called Lydia and arranged to meet with each of the 3 part-time restorers that afternoon. With her help, she was already rattled by Arling's surprise visit, but agreed to cooperate. The first was Daniel Peck, a conservator with long fingers, a nervous laugh and a white beard that he kept combing with his thumb and forefinger, like he was worried it might fall off. He met me at a cafe around the corner from the studio. Of course I've worked on the Dale pieces, he said, but not the clock. That was assigned to Lydia. I mostly did cleaning and case stabilization on some silver items, a chalice and a compass. Were you in the studio the night the clock struck? He shook his head quickly. No, I wasn't scheduled. I was home. I live alone. So, no alibi, if that's what you're asking. It wasn't. But I didn't let him off the hook. Ever see the folio? No. Lydia mentioned something about a misplaced logbook, but I never saw it. His hands were jittery, but that could have been caffeine or nerves. He didn't seem clever enough to rig a clock for psychological warfare, but I took notes and moved on. The second was Nicolette Wren, mid-30s, sharp eyes, sharper tongue, dressed in what I guessed was vintage Armani softened with studio dust. She met me at the studio itself, in one of the private workrooms. Yes, I know the clock. It's a beauty. I would have killed to restore it myself. But Lydia doesn't share toys. You were working the day before it chimed. Briefly. I had a client consult in the afternoon. Left at 5, and you never saw the folio. She hesitated. I heard Lydia mention it. Said it was an odd inclusion. She looked worried, like it might cause trouble. You think someone would steal it? I think someone might want it not to be found. Theft is one way to erase a trail. What about Howard Merle? Name rings a bell. Old political baggage, right? I saw him. Came in during my consult. Creepy type. Moved like he was casing the place, not admiring antiques. That tracked. Wren seemed too guarded to be impulsive, but I made a note to dig deeper. The third restorer was Andre Bianco, a soft-spoken guy, with a deep accent and hands that looked like they were made to cradle old things. We sat in the freight elevator of the building where he worked, which he said doubled as his thinking space. I worked 2 days a week, he said. I never touched the Dale clock. I specialize in wood inlay and gesso. Do you know about the folio? He shrugged. We don't ask. Items come. Items go. But I did notice something strange. Now we were getting somewhere. The cabinet where the folio was kept, he said. Last week before the chimes I saw a man near it. I thought he was a delivery agent, but he had no clipboard. Describe him. Gray suit, glasses, polished shoes. That sounded like Arling. But if Arling had already accessed the folio before it vanished, what was his game? Covering up something, or controlling who saw it first? I returned to the brownstone. Just after 4, Wolfe was in the plant room, speaking softly to his orchids like they were war veterans, and he was offering final confessions. I waited until dinner to give my report. As we sat in the dining room with squab and lentils and a ridiculously well-balanced red wine, I laid out the details. Wolfe listened, chewing slowly. So, he said, when I finished. Mr. Bianco observed Arling near the cabinet prior to the folio's disappearance. Miss Wren sensed tension. Mr. Peck lacks guile. Of the 3, only Wren had both motive and skill to manipulate a mechanism for effect. She also had attitude to spare, I added. She resented Lydia. Sounded like a woman used to being passed over and not taking it well. But would she have given the folio to Merle or to Arling? Wolfe leaned back. The question remains, what was in that folio that required a pantomime of ghostly chimes and clandestine theft? I asked. Want me to follow Wren? No, he said. She will not lead us. The man who will is Merle. His mailbox check-in is tomorrow. Good. Be there. Do not confront him. Learn where he goes. And if he smells me. Wolfe's lips curled slightly. Then make sure he sees what you want him to see. For once, let him underestimate you. That night, I sat at my desk and stared at the photo again. Belden and Dale. A sealed shipment. A name missing. A chain of possession designed to vanish. Then I saw it. In the background, partially obscured, was a plaque on the gallery wall. I had missed it before, but it was there, property of ASSC. A man, a collector, or maybe a broker. The 4th name. The door Wolfe said hadn't been opened yet. The next move was Merle's. I'd be ready. The next morning, I got up earlier than usual, which is to say, before Fritz had finished buttering the toast, and made my way downtown to the private mailbox service. It was Thursday, which meant Howard T. Merle was due to make his weekly pilgrimage. If he kept to routine, I'd have a tail on him before noon. If not, I'd spend the day parked in a rented sedan across from a storefront that sold discounted incense and looked like it hadn't dusted since the first Bush administration. The trick to tailing a man like Merle is that you don't follow him like he's prey. You follow him like you're an accidental companion. A guy like Merle would expect shadows, not distractions. So I made myself into background noise. I leaned against a lamppost. I read a paper. I chewed gum in the kind of slow, unimportant way that tells people your biggest ambition is finishing your crossword. At 11:43 a.m., he showed up. Same gray suit. Same exacting stride. His hair was lacquered into shape, and he looked like he might file complaints in his sleep. He entered the storefront, signed in, and emerged 2 minutes later with a slim, padded envelope under one arm and a carefully folded newspaper under the other. Then he walked. Not quickly, not cautiously, just that deliberate midtown pace that belongs to ex-civil servants and men who remember what a bribe used to cost in 1982. I gave him a block's distance and kept him in view. He didn't take the subway. He didn't hail a cab. He didn't seem to be on guard at all. He just walked. 5 blocks south, 2 blocks east. At 12:07 p.m., he entered an unmarked building on East 45th. Beige stone, polished brass intercom. No name on the directory outside. I waited. After 10 minutes, a delivery guy exited, and I caught the door before it latched. The lobby was tastefully dull. Marble floor, generic wall art, no receptionist. The directory listed only suite numbers, no tenants. I noted the elevator stopped on floors 3, 5, and 7. That was enough. I didn't go in after him. Wolfe's instructions were clear. Observe, don't spook. But I got the address, and I took down the license plate of the delivery van parked out front. Back at the brownstone by 2, I gave Wolfe the report. He was seated in the office, chin low, eyes high, like a hawk perched on a dictionary. So I said, dropping into the red leather chair, Merle checks his mail, walks like a man with nowhere to be, and enters a no-name building with locked suites. Either he's visiting a law firm that likes secrecy, or he's making arrangements with someone who doesn't want to be on record. Wolfe nodded. And the envelope? Unmarked, not thick. Could have held a thumb drive, photos or documents. Very good, he murmured. And the building? I handed him a slip of paper with the address. He scanned it, then reached for the phone and dialed a number from memory. When Saul Panza picked up, Wolfe asked for a discreet background on the building's tenants. No names, no affiliations, just use. Then he hung up without fanfare. It was 3:10 when the phone rang again. Fritz answered and brought it in. For you, he said, raising an eyebrow. Miss Rowntree. I took it. Her voice was taut. Archie, something happened. Nicolette Wren didn't show up for her shift today. She never called. And that's not like her. Have you tried her home number? I did. No answer. And I'm not sure if I'm overreacting, but you're not. Give me the address. She did. I wrote it down and told her I'd check in within the hour. I took a cab to a brownstone in the East 70s. Neat. Upper middle comfort. Wren lived on the 3rd floor. No doorman. No sign of struggle. I rang twice. Then remembered how that had started this whole mess, and tried once more for luck. Nothing. So I tried the super. He was 3 doors down, watching a basketball game with the volume at crime scene level. When I told him who I was and flashed one of Wolfe's cards, he grunted and led me upstairs. Wren's door was locked, but she'd left a key with him in case of orchid emergencies, he said. Whatever that meant, and he used it. The place was warm, lights off. No music, no cat, no clutter, and no Nicolette Wren. But what there was in the center of the coffee table was a photo. The same gallery shot of Dale and Belden. Only this version was cropped differently. It showed the full background plaque. Property of ASA Stoller. That was the 4th name. I called Wolfe the second I stepped outside. Her apartment's empty, I said. She's gone. But she left a breadcrumb. The name A. Stoller. There was a long pause. Then, Alexander Stoller. Antiquities broker. Retired. Once operated out of Geneva and Buenos Aires. Intermediary for high-value transfers with cloudy provenance. Friend of Dale's. Possibly more. He was once indicted, but never tried. Vanished before extradition. He has not been seen publicly in 15 years. Well, he's back, I said. And either Wren went to find him or he came to silence her. Mr. Goodwin, we are now dealing with parties who erase inconvenient witnesses. Locate Miss Wren at once. I called Saul, updated him, and we agreed to coordinate searches. He'd hit hospitals and transit hubs. I'd check any known associates. By nightfall, no sign of her. But at 8:17 p.m., Wolfe received a call from Charles Arling. It was short, polite, cold. I regret to inform you, he said, that one of the Dale restoration team has gone missing. Miss Wren, I understand your firm is looking into certain irregularities. Please be aware that I now consider the entire collection compromised. I will be involving federal oversight. Wolfe didn't react. When the line went dead, he looked at me and said, he's escalating. Not because he fears scrutiny, but because someone else is close to learning the truth. Which means, I said, we are too. He nodded. We must smoke them out. That was Wolfe's version of a battle cry. And this battle was no longer about clocks or missing books. This was about the rewriting of history and the cost of turning the past into a forgery. That night, the brownstone was quieter than usual. Not just the hush of routine. Wolfe had declared silence after 9, as he often did, but a different sort of quiet, a watchful, heavy kind. Fritz padded softly through the halls, more cat than chef, and I found myself resisting the urge to look out the front window every few minutes like I was expecting trouble to knock with a glove on. Wolfe had retired to the orchid rooms, which was less a retreat and more a greenhouse command post. He tended his Miltonias as if they might whisper secrets back at him, and I'd learned long ago not to interrupt when he was doing his thinking through leaves. But I couldn't sit still. Something about Nicolette Wren's disappearance, that deliberately left photo, the missing folio, and the arrival of the name Alexander Stoller, had thrown the whole thing into a sharper, darker focus. This wasn't just estate infighting. It was a battle over what parts of history got to stay buried, and what parts could be sold. I called Lydia again. I still haven't heard from her, she said. No calls, no emails. But something else happened. That caught my ear. Go on. A man came by the studio this morning. Said he was from the State Department. Asked questions about our export licenses, foreign acquisitions, things like that. But something was off. Did he show credentials? He flashed something, but barely. He didn't sign in, and he didn't leave a card. Description. Short, bald, glasses. Accent. British, I think. But it was faint. He knew the term Arling's registry, used it casually, like it was common knowledge, which it wasn't. Not unless you were either Arling or in on the cover-up. I jotted it down and told her to keep alert. Then I called Saul. He answered with, I've got her. Wren? Yes, but not in a hospital. She's in a private care facility upstate. Admitted this morning under the name Anna Worley. Somebody paid cash, left no contact info, and told the staff she was under post-trauma care and should be allowed rest. Condition, conscious, but heavily sedated. Staff thinks it's for anxiety. Could be truth, could be cover. Visitors? None yet. I left my name and told them not to release her. You want me to bring her down? I hesitated. Wolfe didn't like surprises, but he liked gaps in logic even less. Yes, I said. Discreetly, and bring any notes she might have had on her. I hung up and went to tell Wolfe. He was in the office now, back in the big chair, polishing off a second glass of beer, and watching the gold foam settle like he was reading tea leaves in it. I delivered the news. She's alive, he said softly. That's unexpected. Someone went to the trouble of drugging her, hiding her under a false name, and doing it gently enough not to raise alarm, which means they didn't want her dead. Not yet, he thought for a moment. Then, she knows what was in the folio. You think she saw it? No. But she knew what it connected to. The registry. Stoller, Belden, and something else, something not yet surfaced. He reached into a drawer and withdrew the photo again. Mr. Goodwin, we must force the hand of our adversaries. We must reveal the final entry. I nodded. So we stage an invitation. Wolfe gave the tiniest smile. Exactly. You will call Arling. You will inform him that we have acquired the original Stoller catalog, recovered from a third party. You will say it names living individuals. Bluff. He lifted a finger. A nudge. We need him desperate. Not cautious. I made the call. Arling answered on the first ring. Mr. Goodwin, he said. I trust this isn't more speculation. No, it's confirmation. We have the Stoller registry. We intend to turn it over to a federal investigator, unless, of course, Mr. Wolfe decides to entertain a solution more civil. There was a pause. Then, I assume you'll want to discuss this in person. Tonight. Wolfe's office. I'll be there. He hung up. Wolfe was already dialing Saul again. Bring her here, he said. Now. Before the guests arrive. 2 hours later. The brownstone was full of people who didn't trust each other and didn't know if they trusted Wolfe. In the office, seated across from Wolfe's desk, Charles Arling, to his left, Lydia Roundtree, and beside her, still pale but newly alert and holding a glass of water like it was a lifeline, Nicolette Wren. Fritz had insisted on serving coffee, but no one touched it. Saul stood behind the red chair, near the bookshelves, arms folded. Wolfe began with no preamble. Miss Wren, thank you for joining us. I trust your faculties are returning. She gave a slow nod. Enough to know I was meant to forget what I knew. And what was that? She set down the glass. The folio wasn't just an acquisition ledger. It included annotations, references to a list Stoller kept in Switzerland. A second index. Wolfe nodded. An index of what? Where each piece had been before it reached Dale's hands. Some had been acquired illegally. Some were wartime losses. Wolfe turned to Arling. And that, I assume, is what you wish to erase. Arling kept his face composed, but his hands gripped the armrests a little tighter. Mr. Wolfe, he said, you have no proof of any such index. On the contrary, Wolfe said, you attempted to destroy the only person who could authenticate it. You used Merle to recover the folio. You used a false agent to spook Miss Roundtree. And you hoped Miss Wren would disappear quietly. I did nothing of the sort. Wolfe leaned forward. Let me remind you what I have, he said. A photograph placing Stoller with Belden and Dale. A missing folio connected to acquisitions, hidden from the public record. An executor with motive. And a woman who, thanks to a sedative error, woke up before she could be lost entirely. Wolfe gestured gently toward Nicolette. Arling stood up. This is absurd. You've manufactured a conspiracy from shadows. Wolfe looked up at him. Calm. Unblinking. Then sit down, Mr. Arling. Or leave. But know this. I've already instructed Mr. Panzer to deliver a full report, including Miss Wren's hospitalization and your visitor at Grumman, to a federal agent with jurisdiction over cultural repatriation. I have no interest in legal entanglements, but I do not tolerate liars in my house. Arling didn't sit, but he didn't move either. Then Lydia spoke. Charles, she said, her voice low. They already know. There's no point. He turned to her, his jaw clenched. But it was over. In that moment we all knew it. After they left, Arling last, silent and red-faced. I sat in my chair, watching Wolfe pour a third beer. What now? I asked. We release the details carefully, he said. The Dale acquisitions will be reviewed. Some may be repatriated. Some lost. But the truth at least will remain on record. And the clock. A message, Mr. Goodwin. Sent to the wrong person, but heard by the right one. He sipped. History is never quiet, Archie. It only pretends to be. Fritz arrived with dinner, saddle of lamb with rosemary juice, and Wolfe turned his attention to the food. Me? I just leaned back and smiled, because in the end, the case wasn't about what chimed at midnight. It was about who heard it, and who couldn't pretend they hadn't. The next morning, the brownstone was unusually still. Wolfe had eaten his breakfast in absolute silence, an egg dish I couldn't pronounce, served with a fig compote. Fritz swore was seasonal, and afterward he retreated to the orchid rooms without a word. I didn't blame him. The night before had been the kind of verbal duel Wolfe thrived on, and while he might have spent the entire thing in his chair, doing nothing but talk, for him that counted as exertion, especially when his opponent was a man like Charles Arling, suave, strategic, and just desperate enough to be unpredictable. As for me, I'd slept fitfully. There was something about the case that still gnawed. We had Arling dead to rights. Miss Wren had recovered. The missing folio's purpose had been clarified, and Saul was preparing to hand over his summary report to the appropriate authorities. But something about the way Arling had walked out, calm, unrepentant, too quiet, itched like a wool collar in summer. I was just finishing a cup of coffee and rereading my notes when Wolfe rang for me from the office. When I entered, he was already seated, freshly shaved and attired in his usual canary yellow shirt and brown vest. The morning edition of the Gazette was folded neatly on his desk, and his eyes were resting on it, like it had personally offended him. "Archie," he said without looking up, "we are not yet finished. Don't tell me Arling went home and repented." No. But neither did he run, and he should have. Wolfe lifted the paper and handed it to me. Page 5. I turned to it. Executor denies wrongdoing in antique restoration scandal. Arling quoted as saying, "All acquisitions were handled through vetted channels. Any suggestion of impropriety is fabrication by individuals seeking notoriety or leverage." He had doubled down. "Nice," I said. "So he's making it official?" "Yes," Wolfe said, "which means he is either deluded or protected. And knowing our luck, it's the second one." Wolfe nodded. "I want you to speak with Lydia Rowntree again. Alone. Press gently. There is a detail she has withheld. You think she's lying? Not intentionally, but fear causes omission. And she has been afraid since the clock struck." 15 minutes later, I was in a cab, heading to the studio. Lydia met me at the door, with tired eyes and a thin smile. She looked like she hadn't slept much either. "I thought it was over," she said. "I thought you said Wolfe had handled it." "Wolfe never says it's handled. He just stops raising his voice." She offered tea. I declined, and we moved into her office, which was tidier than last time, almost too tidy. Like someone had been organizing for appearances. I got to it. "Lydia, when that clock struck, who did you really think it was meant for?" She looked at me sharply. "I told you. I know what you told me. I want to know what you thought before you polished the story. Before Arling showed up and Wren disappeared." She hesitated. "Then I thought it was for him." "Arling." "No, not Arling." She walked to a drawer and opened it, slowly, pulled out a single envelope. She handed it to me. Inside was a letter, dated 2 weeks before the incident with the clock. The letterhead read, "Alexander Stoller." The letter was brief. "Miss Rowntree, a favor. Should the Dale clock return to your studio, do not assume it is entirely dormant. You will be watched. What follows has implications beyond collection. You must remain discreet." That was it. No signature. No address. "Why didn't you give this to Wolfe?" I asked. "Because I didn't know what it meant," she said, almost pleading. "It arrived anonymously. I didn't connect it until after everything began. Then it was too late." "Where did it come from?" "No return address, just a courier envelope, dropped off by hand." That made sense. A man like Stoller wouldn't rely on stamps. I folded the letter and placed it back. "Wolfe was right," I said. The clock was never for you. It was Stoller's way of saying, I'm watching. I know where the folio is. I know what's coming. He was sounding the alarm for himself. But why warn me? Because you're in the middle. You weren't a player. You were the board. She swallowed. Do you think he's still alive? Wolfe didn't deal in ghosts, and neither did I. Yes, I said. And I think he wanted Arling to hear that clock, to remind him of unfinished business. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe took the letter and read it twice, saying nothing. Then he rang Saul. Mr. Panzer, he said, begin looking for Alexander Stoller. Not in New York, in Switzerland. He will have resurfaced. He hung up. Then he looked at me. Archie, Arling is not the architect. He is a custodian. The real hand behind this is still in shadow. If Stoller is alive, and he is, then he has watched all of this unfold without intervening, which means he believes the game is still in play. And if it is, then it is time we moved our final piece. That evening, Wolfe summoned all involved parties to the brownstone. It was an odd gathering. Arling, Lydia, Nicolette, pale but steady, Saul, and to everyone's confusion, Howard T. Merle. Wolfe sat in his chair, untouched beer at hand, eyes half-lidded like a lion watching cubs fight over scraps. He began. The folio was not a ledger, he said. It was an invitation. It contained references designed to be seen by the right person. He turned to Merle. You stole it. You passed it to Arling, but you made a copy, didn't you? Merle stiffened. You made a copy, Wolfe said again, and you sent it to Stoller, or someone close to him. That's a lie, Arling snapped. It's the only truth that explains why you've been so careful, Wolfe replied. Why Miss Wren was sedated, not silenced. Why Miss Wrentree received that letter before anything began. Someone wanted this scandal exposed. But only halfway, he looked at them all. A final game between two men. Stoller and Arling, and the rest of us. Pawn. Arling stood. I will not. You will, Wolfe said sharply. Or the full copy will reach the newspapers by morning. How do you know it exists? Arling said. Wolfe smiled. I don't, he said. But you do. Arling didn't speak again. And Wolfe didn't need him to. When the guests were gone, Wolfe stayed silent for a long time. Then he spoke. Power, Mr. Goodwin, is not always in possession. Sometimes it is in what one allows others to believe is held. This was never about truth. It was about control. And now we eat. And Fritz appeared with duck confit and haricots verts, and the world for a moment was back in balance. Outside, somewhere in the dark, a clock that hadn't chimed in 20 years remained silent. But we had heard it, and it had been enough. The next morning broke with a soft rain drizzling down West 35th Street, and the brownstone, insulated as ever from the indignities of weather, remained calm. Fritz was preparing breakfast, shirred eggs again, this time with a delicate leek sauce, and I was in the office nursing coffee and watching the city sulk behind the windows. Wolfe hadn't emerged yet. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the absence of mail. No courier, no packages, no quiet thump of an envelope sliding through the door slot. It was the first quiet morning we'd had since the Dale clock struck its unwelcome twin notes. I should have known better than to relax. At 10:07 a.m., the phone rang. I picked it up. Nero Wolfe's residence. Archie Goodwin speaking. Mr. Goodwin, came the voice, low, clipped, with a soft European lilt. I hope this is not an intrusion. I straightened. Depends on who's calling. I believe you've been waiting for me. My name is Alexander Stoller, just like that. No fanfare, no coded message. The man we'd been circling for days had finally picked up the other end of the line. I would like, he continued, to speak with Mr. Wolfe, privately. Today. I kept my tone light. That's a rare privilege, Mr. Stoller. Most people don't even get his attention unless they've either committed murder or are interrupting lunch. I assure you I will not do either. I am calling from New Jersey. I can be at the brownstone within 2 hours. I looked toward the stairs. One moment. I found Wolfe in the plant rooms clipping a cymbidium hybrid with a precision that suggested he was either in a good mood or in deep thought. "Stoller's on the line," I said. "Wants a private meeting." Wolfe didn't look up. "Tell him 11:30. No later." I relayed the message. Stoller agreed. When I returned to the office, Wolfe was already in his chair. "I suppose," he said, "that the game is nearing its final movement. Feels more like we're entering the epilogue." He raised a brow. "Mr. Stoller does not make house calls to deliver endings. He arrives to ensure they are shaped to his liking." At 11:27, the doorbell rang. Once, perfectly timed. I opened it to a man who looked like he'd been pressed from a mold, labeled Old World Precision. Early 70s, lean, immaculately dressed in a slate-gray suit with an ivory pocket square. And eyes so pale they made blue seem like an exaggeration. He offered his hand like it was a gesture he rarely gave. "Mr. Goodwin." "Thank you." I led him in. Wolfe remained seated when Stoller entered, of course, but his eyes flicked upward in the manner he reserved for opera singers and poisonous mushrooms. "Mr. Stoller," he said, "please sit." Stoller did. "Your arrival," Wolfe said, "is either an act of mercy or a final warning. I'm uncertain which. I would like it to be a conclusion," Stoller said calmly. "But yes, a conclusion on my terms." Wolfe inclined his head. "Speak." "I have spent 30 years managing the shadows of other men's crimes," Stoller said. "Art is not always beautiful. Sometimes it is soaked in blood, or in bribes, or in the quiet misery of the displaced. I did what I could to repatriate where it was possible, and to conceal where it was not. Marcus Dial was many things, ambitious, vain, but not stupid. He knew the value of secrecy, and so did." "You maintained the registry," Wolfe said. "The real one?" Stoller nodded. "I kept copies. Enough to ensure I could never be disposed of easily. And when Dale died, I disappeared. Not out of fear. Out of strategy. I knew Arling would try to erase everything. That is why I left the note for Miss Rowntree, and why I arranged for the folio's inclusion in the shipment." Wolfe leaned forward slightly. "So the folio's arrival at Grumman and Larchmont was no accident?" "No," Stoller said. "It was bait. I wanted to see who would move first. Merle, Wren, Arling." "And what did you see?" Wolfe asked. Stoller gave a soft smile. "That some people still believe in erasure through intimidation, and others still believe in decency. Miss Wren's actions confirmed what I suspected. Arling had become too eager, too direct. He would eventually ruin what little discretion remained. And so," Wolfe said, "you allowed yourself to be seen." "Precisely. And now I am here to offer a solution." Wolfe's eyes closed briefly. When they opened, they were sharper. "You will give the full registry to the authorities," Wolfe said. "All of it. Not just what pertains to Dale." Stoller nodded. "Yes. And in exchange, I want Miss Rowntree left untouched. Her studio must not be drawn into scandal. And Miss Wren, she is to receive full immunity for her role. She committed no crime. She copied private documentation. That is enough for men like Arling to make trouble." Wolfe considered him. "And Arling? I will deal with him. He has already lost what he wanted most, control. What remains is posturing." Silence lingered. Finally, Wolfe said, "Done." Stoller rose. "Thank you, Mr. Wolfe. You have conducted this like a surgeon. No unnecessary cuts." Wolfe allowed himself the faintest smile. "There is no pleasure in crude incisions." Stoller nodded once to me, then exited. We watched the front door close. I exhaled. "Well, that's that." "No," Wolfe said. "That is enough. That afternoon, Saul delivered the registry to an old contact at the Department of Homeland Security's Cultural Property Division. Quietly, without headline, by nightfall, Arling had resigned his position. No charges yet, but the quiet exit of a man who had once believed the past could be bent, bartered, and burned. Wren resumed her work at the studio. Lydia Roundtree sent a case of Burgundy to the brownstone, with a card that read simply, "Thank you for knowing when to listen." That evening, Wolfe and I sat in the office. It was dark outside, rain soft against the windows. I poured us both a finger of brandy, a rare moment. "Well," I said, "you got your justice. No shouting, no arrests, just slow exposure, like a photograph appearing in a tray." Wolfe sipped. "Justice, Mr. Goodwin, is not always loud. It does not always need a gavel or a jail." "No," I said, raising my glass. "Sometimes it just needs a clock that rings when it shouldn't." Wolfe nodded once, deeply, and we sat, listening to the silence, which, for the first time in weeks, felt honest. The next morning unfolded with the unremarkable rhythm of restored order. Fritz was back to humming tunelessly in the kitchen, while preparing a duck consommé. Wolfe had insisted on testing 3 variations of "The Orchids Were Being Misted in Their Schedule-Driven Sanctum," and I, Archie Goodwin, was back at my desk, pretending to catch up on paperwork while reading a magazine article about the declining standards of city architecture. The brownstone, in short, was breathing its usual calm again. Except it wasn't. Not quite. Not yet. Wolfe had spent most of the previous evening in silence, not out of contentment but out of calculation. I could tell he had the same look I'd seen on him after a particularly complicated chess game. One where he'd won technically, but suspected the other player had let him. It was 9:32 a.m. when the doorbell rang. Once, I opened it to find a young woman with cropped hair, steel-rimmed glasses, and the posture of someone who took rules seriously. She handed me an envelope, nodded, and turned without a word. The envelope was unmarked. I brought it to Wolfe, who was already seated in his office chair with the morning paper folded on his lap. I placed it on his desk. He raised an eyebrow, but didn't touch it for a full minute. Then, with a sigh, he slit it open with his silver letter knife. Inside, a single sheet of thick paper. Type. No signature, no heading. "Your discretion was expected and appreciated. The matter will rest here. But be advised, not all artifacts of the past are content to remain in storage. Some are weapons, some are warnings. Thank you for choosing the correct distinction." Wolfe folded the note and placed it in his top drawer, without a word. "That from Stoller?" I asked. "Yes. He has a way with vague ominousness. He was always a strategist," Wolfe said. "Even his gratitude is encoded." "And that's it?" I asked. "That's how this ends?" A quiet nod from a ghost. "There are worse endings," Wolfe replied. "Many involve courtrooms." He reached for his beer, took a sip, and closed his eyes for a moment. Then he opened them and said, "What remains are the fragments. We should sort them." That was Wolfe's way of saying we were going to perform a mental post-mortem. He didn't like leaving threads frayed, even if the whole coat had been stitched back together. I took out my notes, flipped open the first page, and started reading aloud. Marcus Dale's estate included the dormant French mantel clock. Accidentally or not, sent to Grumman and Larchmont. Lydia Roundtree receives a warning from Stoller before it arrives. The clock strikes twice. Someone breaks into the locked cabinet, the folio vanishes, and suddenly 3 people, Roundtree, Wren, and Arling, find themselves entangled in a game they didn't start. "Correction," Wolfe said, lifting a finger. "Arling helped continue the game. The player who started it was Stoller." "Right," I said. "He sets the whole thing in motion with that folio." "Why?" "To observe." "You said that before. But why not just drop the registry into the public's lap and watch the fireworks?" Wolfe scowled. "Because fireworks are noisy, indiscriminate. Stoller wanted control. He wanted precision. And so he fed the information through a quiet, self-contained storm. Lydia's studio. Yes. where he knew the right people would react, and where the wrong ones could be observed. I whistled low. That's cold. It is effective, Wolfe said. We sat a moment. Then I asked, and what happens now? Wren goes back to work. Lydia continues restoring 18th century treasures. Arling sulks into retirement, and Stoller fades away again. Wolfe shrugged. Unless he chooses otherwise, which he may. But we're out of it. Yes. That should have satisfied me, but it didn't. Not entirely. There's still something about that clock that bugs me. Wolfe raised a brow. Do you propose a ghost, Mr. Goodwin? No. But I do wonder how long Stoller was watching, because that clock was last catalogued as broken 2 years ago. That means either he knew it could be made to strike, or he arranged for someone to make it do so. Wolfe considered that. Yes, which implies someone inside Grumman knew about the message. Someone helped him. That, Wolfe said slowly, would not surprise me. I sat back. Then the game isn't over. The visible game is, Wolfe said. What continues is what always continues. Power, moving through hidden places, facilitated by those who prefer to remain unseen. We are not police, Archie. We are not moral arbiters. We are... An interruption, I said. Yes. There was a knock on the doorframe. Fritz, holding a card. A messenger just delivered this, he said. Wolfe took it, opened it, and read. Then passed it to me. It was from Lydia. Mr. Wolfe, the Dale collection has been officially reassessed. Several pieces will be returned to their countries of origin. I am told quietly that this will be used as a model for other questionable estates. Thank you. Hello. I smiled. So we did a little good after all. Wolfe said nothing. Just before dinner, I stepped outside for air. The rain had stopped, and the city was slipping into that gray-blue hour, where everything looks temporary. I walked 2 blocks, thought about clock, thought about the sound of something ringing when it shouldn't, waking up people who didn't want to be woken. When I got back, the house was quiet again. Fritz was plating the duck consommé. Wolfe was in the dining room waiting. I sat. He tasted the broth, closed his eyes, and said perfect. And that, at last, was the end. Dinner that night was a quiet affair. Not solemn, just weightless. As if some invisible pressure that had been squeezing the air out of the brownstone had finally let go. Wolfe finished his duck consommé with the kind of pleased silence usually reserved for orchid buds and saffron imports. I let Fritz's lemon tart distract me from my notes, and neither of us brought up Arling, Stoller, or anything that had recently struck twice in the middle of the night. After dessert, I lingered in the office with a second glass of brandy. Wolfe remained in his chair, a soft leather sentinel against the quiet evening, his hands folded across his middle like he was waiting for history to come ask him for a favor. You going to write this one up for the records? I asked. No, he said. That was a surprise. Wolfe rarely refused to commit a case to the files. Even the delicate ones got a sealed envelope and a label in German. He opened his eyes. There is no satisfaction in documentation when the truth is only partial, he said. We intervened. We did not uncover all that remains buried. You think Stoller's still hiding things? I'm certain of it. Well, sure, I said, sipping. But that's like saying the ocean has water. The man spent his life orchestrating the unseen. He's not about to switch to transparency now, to transparency.